Hello, I'm Jim Cornell, and this is Base to Base, the weekly biotech podcast from Air Coastal Media. Yes, welcome again to the Base to Base biotech podcast, and this is number 46, and it's going live on February the 13th. Although that's likely not when most people will listen to it. A Friday the 13th, followed by Valentine's Day. What could go wrong? I hope you're enjoying the Winter Olympics if you're watching them or listening on the radio to that or the World Cup cricket. After all, today is Radio Day. And it's Blame Someone Else Day, Apology Day and Desperation Day. Last week we chatted with David Baker, CEO of Affibody, about radioligand therapy and about chronic pain and urology with Martin Gleave, founder and chief medical officer at Sustained Therapeutics. This week the conversations are with Vibhor Gupta, director and founder of Pangaea Data, and Endogene.bio CEO María Teresa Pérez Zaballos. If you do have news or suggestions for who should be on the podcast, or indeed any other suggestions or comments, please do get in touch at jim@deeptechdigest.com, which is also the address you can use if you're interested in advertising or for event coverage. Alright, let's take a quick look at the news you may have missed over the past week at deeptechdigest.com. We had an article on predicting cancer evolution, the introduction of next-generation biopreservation for cell therapy, and IQVIA and Boehringer Ingelheim announced a data collaboration. Origami Therapeutics and Ipsen are collaborating to advance a protein degrader program. Skin damage protein ID could lead to new therapies, and a Pfizer injectable showed continued weight loss in a Phase 2b trial. Yeast cells can be used for rapid testing of cancer immunotherapy. A cholangiocarcinoma treatment has received orphan drug designation, and a world-first personalised paediatric mRNA cancer vaccine trial is starting. Zonsen Peplib Biotech is going to be collaborating with Eli Lilly. The body's own defence system may be the key to longer cancer survival, and Calla Lilly Clinical Care and Merck are going to collaborate on an intravaginal drug delivery platform. You can read all of these and plenty more at deeptechdigest.com. Okay, let's move on to today's first interview, and it is with Vibhor Gupta, founder of Pangaea Data. The company's platform emulates clinical reasoning to scan doctors' notes and pathology reports, and this is used to identify care gaps across conditions such as oncology, rare diseases, and chronic kidney disease. Alright, hi Vibhor, thanks for being with us today, and I'm looking forward to learning more about the company and how you're helping patients. Maybe we could start with some information on the company itself.
Pangaea is a group of engineers, scientists, and clinicians who came together 8 years ago in London with the vision to help transform care in a manner which was not disruptive for everything the clinicians and the providers at health systems were doing today. And with that vision in mind, we have built a product platform which combines mathematical constructs, which we today call artificial intelligence, with clinical guidelines that clinicians use in their daily lives to help achieve that vision I just described. And we're very proud about the work we're doing and the scale at which we are operating, which has taken us into 14 countries now.
Could you tell me a bit about the partnership that you have with AstraZeneca?
Yes. So the work that we do stems from this need in medicine, which is to close care gaps. And by care gaps, I'm referring to instances where a patient remains untreated or undertreated in spite of information in their records. This happens due to several reasons, but let me illustrate this through an example. So I'm a GP. My patient walks in through the door complaining of an upper respiratory chest infection. I've got 10 minutes with the patient. I will treat them for that chest infection at the time, might recommend them some anti-inflammatories, a COVID test perhaps. And if it's been going on for long, I might even consider prescribing them some antibiotics. And that'll be my 10 minutes with that particular patient, and they leave my office. But lo and behold, in about 3 to 6 months, the same patient might come back in need for dialysis. And me and my medical director are scratching our heads thinking, we just saw this patient 3 or 6 months ago. How come they are now in need for dialysis? What did we miss? And at that point, when we look through their entire record, we find instances and clues which, had we reviewed at the time, would have told us that this patient was also, there was something going wrong with this patient's kidneys, which would have merited some tests. And had we gotten those tests done at the initial time, when we saw the patient 3 or 6 months ago, then this patient, their trajectory could have been very different to what it is right now. Now, in that scenario that I have described, you can imagine as a clinician, you might think, well, in the 10 minutes I have with the patient, I just don't have the time to go through the entire record and connect the dots for all diseases that are known to mankind. It is just impossible. And these dots, don't forget, are symptoms which are non-specific. They could be common across multiple different conditions. And as a health system, you're saying, well, now the patient has come back in need for dialysis. So we've got to make available a bed, in the hospital. We've got to make nursing staff available. And all of that, along with the treatment that the patient has to go in through, is probably going to be 6 times more than what it could have been had we taken care of the patient initially. So in this example, what I'm trying to illustrate, and this happens time and again, right? If you look at the literature, it is reported that up to 90% of the patients could be falling in these care gaps in spite of information in their records. So who is at a disadvantage? The patient, of course, at number one, who are not being treated or are not receiving the treatment that they deserve. You have the clinician and the health system who now have to do more for the same patient when they could have avoided that. But equally, they're still strapped for time, and there could be several other patients who have fallen in the care gaps, as far which is a bigger concern for them. And third, of course, is the pharmaceutical company, because pharmaceutical companies have these treatments on the market, let's say for treating patients with chronic kidney disease. Now, in the scenario that I've described, that patient is not going to benefit from that treatment because their condition has worsened and they've gone further down the hill, as it was. And equally, if pharmaceutical companies are running some clinical trials around chronic kidney disease, then even that's a missed opportunity, because now this patient's condition has worsened and would not benefit from that kind of a trial. So you can imagine for a company like AstraZeneca, the same holds true, where they're saying, look, if we are spending billions of dollars in research to come up with these therapies and trials which could benefit patients, and we want to make sure that these care gaps don't exist. But a pharma company like that cannot work directly with health systems to help close those care gaps. There are very strict rules around compliance. And they certainly, they don't want to be seen to be telling the clinicians what to do, especially when the clinicians have such little time on their hands and they're already strapped. So this is where Pangaea came in, because Pangaea as a platform is helping those clinicians close those care gaps at the point of care by providing them insights based on the patient's record and existing guidelines, so the clinician can do what's right for the patient. And is secondly providing the health systems for which their clinicians work for a population health view of how many other such patients could exist across multiple different conditions, and therefore helping them quantify the size of those care gaps and what needs to happen in order to close those care gaps. And for the pharma companies, it's providing them high-level population health level data, which is de-identified, which helps these pharma companies understand the quantum and the size of these care gaps again, but equally where they could provide value during their discussions with the health systems. So that when one of their colleagues from pharma goes and visits a clinician, they're not just telling them about their latest therapy or trial, but they're actually saying, what we see, I'm going to take a leaf out of the scenario just described, that we see that there are these 100 patients who could benefit from a screening of chronic kidney disease through an EGFR test. How can we help you? Can we loan you some contractors, some pharmacists to take these patients to the screening because we know that you might be strapped for resources as it is? Or could we help you with some free tests to take these patients through and do what's best for them? Or is there anything else we can help you with in the context of chronic kidney disease or anything else related to it in the cardiovascular, renal, or metabolic domain? So that conversation becomes more objective and collaborative as opposed to being transactional around, hey, here is the latest therapy from us and, or the latest trial, and then limiting it to that.
With artificial intelligence, everybody seems to be looking to data and AI and utilizing AI as much as possible. Do you think that all companies have a solid understanding of how AI and how data is going to help them and an understanding of what their own needs really are?
There is in the industry right now a lot of information about what is possible with AI. There are lots of updates that are provided on a daily basis about what's happening in the world of AI. And certainly companies, pharmaceutical companies, health systems, and vendors like us are constantly trying to work with that information to see how it could help our respective businesses and help us achieve the mission that we're here to achieve. So for a health system, their mission is to improve patient outcomes in a sustainable manner. For pharmaceutical companies, is to improve patient outcomes by providing the latest and the greatest by way of therapies and trials. And for vendors like us in Pangaea, we of course also want to improve patient outcomes through the use of technology. So if you see, there's a common thread here, which is improving patient outcomes. That's the North Star. Now, in order to achieve that, the means to that end, if it happens to be some mathematical construct which has recently been developed, then that's great. And if it can help us do that in a financially sustainable and a compliant manner, that's very fortuitous. And that's really the way most of the executives that I've talked to in these organizations are thinking about AI. Where, yes, there's an information overload, but at the end of the day, we still have to focus on our mission and what we want to achieve, and then work backwards from that and see how can all of this new development in AI and technology and what have you can be combined with all the knowledge that we have collectively about the processes, about the people that we work with, and sort of get to a solution which is financially sustainable and compliant. So now, have there been instances where the cart was put before the horse, where you just ran with the technology and the perception that it would just lead to magic? Yes, of course, but that is just part and parcel of any kind of innovation. Where there will always be times where you have you experiment with something, you just run with it. It might not help you achieve your core mission. That is part of your key performance indicator, perhaps, but it'll always help you learn as to what the capabilities are. Right, and help the others learn from your experience. It's all very positive. And yes, I do see companies being at different ends of the spectrum. Some are early adopters who would want to just go in heads down and see what comes out of it because they have the wherewithal to do it. There are very few of them, granted, but they are there. And then there will be others who will be watching that first cohort, learning from them. But still, I would call them early adopters because they would still like to take a much more structured approach to deploying these technologies and how it marries up with their most imminent objectives. And then there will always be the cynics and the skeptics on the other end of the spectrum, which is great because it always helps people like us learn from them because they are expressing concerns, some of which are going to be very important to consider and think about as you try to innovate and make this become part of the mainstream.
And I know you gave the example of the kidney disease and kidney issues earlier, which was really helpful. What are some of the other challenges that companies and even the entire healthcare system, from physicians to patients, are facing?
So if you think about that example I talked about, everybody as a human can relate to it. When you go and visit your doctor as a patient, you're always thinking, well, the doctor recommended this, in that example, an anti-inflammatory. right? Because I went in for a chest infection and recommended a COVID test. Okay, why did they recommend an anti-inflammatory to me? Why did they not give me an antibiotic, which I read about on Google or ChatGPT in this day and age? Those are questions that come to mind as a patient. Or what happens next if this doesn't work in the next 3 or 4 days and my cough worsens, or I start contracting fever? What should I do next? Do I need to come back in? Would it be easy for me to get the appointment again with the clinician? Or is there something else I could do at home, like home remedies with hot water, with lemon and honey and all the rest of it? So you are thinking about those things as a patient. Now, the clinician, on the other hand, is thinking, well, did I do everything that I needed to do for this patient? Did I record it correctly? Because, there are strict rules and compliance standards that I need to meet. Did I make sure that the patient was given the prescription that I need to give them so that they can be on their medicines? When do I need to see them next? What if the patient doesn't adhere to my prescription? What's going to be my next port of call? What do I need to say on the system about what I read? The patient was a bit hesitant to try anti-inflammatories, or the patient was just very nervous, or the patient seemed very confident, or they were traveling. Like, what are things that I need to think about to make sure this patient gets the best care possible and recovers? So their objectives are very different. And then everybody else in the ecosystem around them will have other priorities to think about. So just that one visit, that one patient-clinician conversation has several different facets to it. That's the point I'm trying to make. And technology has already shown how it can positively impact one or many of those facets. We, of course, are helping with the aspect of closing care gaps. There are others, for example, who are streamlining the process for the patient being able to schedule that visit with the clinician. Others are helping provide the electronic health record system for the clinician to record the information about the patient. Some others are providing ambient listening tools to record the conversation between the clinician and the patient and automatically structure it in a digital format in the form of a record. And then there are now companies who are providing these applications on mobile phones for patients to ask questions. Okay, your clinician recommended this treatment. What does this mean for you? Or what does this treatment generally mean in layman terms? What you should be watching out for, just so that information is easily digestible. So there are umpteen areas to create value, and technology is certainly playing its part over there. And we're very excited because that's really what we're here to do.
Where are you able to influence that? Where can you help in that pathway?
So we're helping ensure that that patient who's sitting in front of the clinician, albeit for an upper respiratory chest infection, if something is going on with their kidneys, then that information is flagged to the clinician right then and there, so they can do something about it. So they can refer the patient for a screening test or a treatment, so that the patient doesn't progress in need for a dialysis in 3 to 6 months. And that's really where we are helping, and we're very excited about that. And we've shown through our case studies, number one, being able to find several times more patients who were falling in these care gaps and were hidden in plain sight in spite of information in the records. As important as that was, we've also been able to now demonstrate how the discovery of those patients have helped the clinicians do better for these patients and improve outcomes, and more importantly, do so in a manner which allowed them to also demonstrate a return on their investment in the technology, that is Pangaea, both from a clinical standpoint and also from a financial standpoint. So by being able to, of course, improve the clinical outcomes of the patient, but triage the patients effectively. So not everyone is being referred to a GP or a cardiologist or a nephrologist just because there was a risk factor or symptom appearing in the record, but they're really referred because there is something going on with the patient that merits attention, or that they were able to demonstrate how they were able to increase revenues by referring these patients appropriately and doing the treatment reviews and save cost. In the UK, we showed how in one such instance, they were able to halve the cost of treatment from £10,000 to £5,000 in each patient. And there was a large population of 200,000 such patients. So the case studies speak for themselves, and we're very excited at the prospect of being able to do this at scale across multiple hard-to-diagnose conditions.
And how do life science companies decide upon which AI companies or providers will be the most use to them? Because there seem to be a lot of AI companies at the moment.
Yes. I mean, of course, it's like when you and I have to shop for something, there's always more than one manufacturer of that thing. And we decide based on some objective metrics and some more emotional aspects or subjective aspects. And I'm sure the same holds true for companies. At least in our experience, they will look at the science which has gone into building the product and how that is being married with technology, that means to an end I referred to earlier, to achieve that scientific or clinical objective, and how that can translate into helping them achieve their core mission. So that's that. And then that can easily be measured based on peer-reviewed publications, case studies, and what have you. And then there is, of course, the subjective aspects where I'm sure they look at the team, their backgrounds, their credibility, their referenceability, and also what makes the company stable. Because at the end of the day, yes, several hundreds of AI companies, but then as a big pharmaceutical or as a health system, you want to work with someone is going to be around in 6 months' time. So they do their due diligence around that as well, from our experience.
Looking into the crystal ball, I guess, how do you see AI as impacting healthcare in 2026?
I think if you look at the AI world, there are several different layers to it. We started hearing about it in the context of the infrastructure layer, the GPUs from NVIDIA and others, who were providing these chips to help you have the hardware that you needed to execute these, complex computational algorithms. So actually, I would call that as different layer, it's the chips. And then you have the infrastructure layer where you combine these chips and you create a data center and so on and so forth. And then on the back of that infrastructure and those chips, now you are building these large language models, for example, like you have ChatGPT, Llama, DeepSeek, etc. And then now you're getting to the application layer, where the question is, how do you use all of these models that have been built for some kind of application? We are seeing advancements across those layers in AI today. In 2026, we're just going to continue seeing more. If I was to say what I would like to see, I would just like to see more success stories, right? Where the combination of all these layers has helped people like you and me, right? In some capacity, whatever that might be. In healthcare, it might be that we helped find patients who were hidden in plain sight, and now their lives are much better because they've now been diagnosed for these hard to diagnose conditions, be it prevalent or rare, and now their quality of life is much better. Or it might be that now the sales teams at pharmaceutical companies have a better way to know where they can help their customers who are clinicians and health systems, as opposed to just approaching each one with a brochure of their latest therapy. Or there's a new drug discovered using the AI, which typically in half the time or in half the cost, which would help reduce the cost of treatments anyway. So, just having some of those success stories would be very opportune. And I think we're just at that cusp where we certainly at Pangaea have already published a lot of these case studies. And now we're looking to see their impact at scale. And I'm sure others working in other upstream or downstream areas from us are looking to do the same.
Some really good examples there of just how much of the healthcare system is affected when you're able to make positive changes. Now we're going to talk about women's health, and more specifically endometriosis. The company Endogene.bio is using menstrual blood to develop biomarkers and personalized treatments for endometriosis, which, according to the company's founder, María Teresa Perez Zaballos, is a range of conditions. To tell us more, we have María on the podcast with us today. Thanks so much for taking the time, and I wonder if first you can tell us a little bit about the history of Endogene.bio.
Sure. So Endogene.bio is a uterine health company. And what we do is we use menstrual blood to study the uterus in a non-invasive way. It's basically a very interesting tissue marker because you have the convenience of a liquid biopsy because you can collect it non-invasively with a menstrual cup, but then it has tissue inside, and that's the part that we are interested in. So it gives us direct access to biology that's otherwise very hard to measure. And so we use that to generate multi-omic profiles, and then we use computational models to characterize patient heterogeneity, which I think, as we will see during the interview, it's central to solving a few of the key issues in women's health. And so we use that to define sort of disease subtypes and then develop novel targets based off of that. Menstrual blood is really interesting because it's the reflection of menstrual cycle, which is something very unique to humans. If you think about it, menstruation is something very modern, evolutionary. So it's only 1.5% of mammals that menstruate. And that's very interesting because when you look at what are most of the uterine conditions that exist, they affect sort of the second part of the cycle. And that's the part that is unique to menstruation, this thing where the endometrium spontaneously decidualizes, so specializes basically. Without needing an embryo, it does it spontaneously. So that's why it's so interesting that we have the opportunity to collect this tissue through menstrual blood.
Do companies that are working on issues associated with the menstrual cycle, do they utilize menstrual blood, or is this something that hasn't been done very much?
No, not at all. There's some companies like us exploring it, but all of the companies we are in sort of an early stage, there's nothing used commercially except Quivin recently got FDA approval for measuring glucose using a menstrual pad, but properly like evaluating uterine biology through menstrual blood, nothing commercially. And that's where, we think it's a wasted opportunity. We should be actually running most of our fertility trials or our endometriosis trials, collecting this type of samples, because it really gives direct insights, no? And we're not doing so today.
Right. Yeah, you would think that would be logical to do. Yeah. Is this something new? I mean, is there a lot of literature on the differences with menstrual blood?
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that at the beginning, people were very fixated on the blood component. But the interesting thing for us is the tissue that you access. Like suddenly, it's like if you could do, for example, for lung, like a biopsy of the lung every month, no? So you could check progression, you could check a lot of things. And there is literature on menstrual blood because there's basic research on it, like characterizing all these cell types, etc. But there is nothing kind of done at scale, and that's the issue. That's why we have to build all the data sets prospectively, right? Which means running clinical studies.
All right. Are there other companies, is academia working on this, or are you kind of at the forefront?
No, they are very potent research groups working on this. The issue that they face is the lack of funding. So that restricts, for example, how many samples they can process or how far they can go in their research. A lot of the earlier research was sponsored by some pharmaceutical companies that have since pulled out some of this external innovation funding, and that has affected the field quite hard, I would say. But there are a couple of research groups in the UK, in Australia, in Leuven as well, in Belgium and the US that are very good in this field.
You would think that it would be something that's quite important and that it would have more emphasis, but
yeah, we've pioneered the use of methylation specifically in a particular cell type that's called menstrual stem cells, that it's a rare cell type. And we've been the first ones to characterize it fresh, because usually you culture it because it's so rare. But yeah, there are different groups working on different things. The immune component in the US, there's a very potent group looking into it. Then there's more the stromal component, which is where this cell that we look at sort of sits in the family of cells. So lots of research and advances done in the area. And I think each one of us is kind of pioneering a part of it. And it's beautiful to see then, how it comes together, because for us, the interesting thing is also integrating kind of what others are doing to have a complete view of uterine health. And it wouldn't be possible if these groups wouldn't be working on this.
That's good. Could you give me a bit more background on endometriosis itself?
Yeah, maybe let's start from the beginning, because endometriosis is our first indication and use case. Endometriosis is a chronic inflammatory condition, and it involves tissue that it's similar to the uterine lining, so the endometrium, that is growing outside, kind of like a benign tumor. But what happens is that it drives a lot of pain, fatigue, bowel and bladder syndromes, and also infertility. Actually, around 50% of endometriosis patients have infertility issues. And it's one of the biggest drivers, if not the biggest, with PCOS of infertility. One key thing I would say about the disease is that it's super common because it's 10% of the female population. And still we have 10 years of diagnostic delay. And then the treatments, we don't have a single curative one. So I think it's a very high unmet need.
Yeah, absolutely. What are the current treatments that are available? I know you said there really isn't one, but
there are treatments, and they are mostly aimed at controlling symptoms. So the first line is usually painkillers and contraception, and specifically progestin, because this is a disease that typically responds to estrogen. And so, as I said, the menstrual cycle is very interesting because you have a first part that is dominated by estrogen, which drives proliferation. So when you have tissue like the uterine lining and you expose it to estrogen, it just keeps growing. And then progesterone drives tissue specialization and death in the endometrium. So these cells tend to have a bit of resistance to that. But the thinking behind using hormones is, I'm going to suppress the estrogen and create a progesterone dominant state to try to limit disease growth. But because there's this resistance, it doesn't work in many people. So there is a subset of patients that respond well to this, but many don't. And so the second line is quite strong because it's GnRH agonists or antagonists. Today we use more antagonists because they have oral formulations. Imagine before women had to inject themselves because these were designed for infertility. And so what happens is that typically they are prescribed with add-back estrogen therapy because they're very strong. They suppress hormones at the pituitary gland level, and so you induced a sort of menopause state. So they have problems with bone demineralization, hot flashes, and all the many things that we see associated with menopause. So adding back estrogen typically helps to limit those. But I personally think it's a very strong treatment to be prescribing to a large population. So again, stratification, which is what I think will drive endometriosis success. So that's a little bit the landscape that we have. And then if nothing works, you have surgery.
Can you tell me a bit about the diversity of endometriosis? Because clearly it's not just one specific thing that everybody has an identical condition, I guess.
A lot of heterogeneity. And I think in the field, we're starting to think about it more as a sort of umbrella or a family of diseases, because so you have differences on where the lesions sit. So if it's in the ovaries, if it's in the peritoneum, or if it's deep infiltrating into some organs, like, for example, the digestive tract, and they present very differently. For example, ovarian lesions tend to grow like very big, create this, what we call chocolate cysts. In the peritoneum, they tend to be more like small and scattered. And then you have also, you can classify it per pain, because having big lesions doesn't necessarily correlate with a lot of pain. So there are some classifications, but they're mostly based on kind of clinical and observational findings. But we are starting to see that molecularly, we also have very different disease subtypes. And that's very interesting because we find ourselves in something that looks a lot like oncology. And in fact, when you look at the disease pathways, they look very similar. So when in many conferences now in endometriosis, when they start, there's always somebody that pulls up, the oncology flywheel, where you have the different pathways, of migration, apoptosis resistance, all of this. It's also present in endometriosis. And we're starting to see that beyond the imaging classification, there are molecular classifications that are emerging.
How do those differences in the kinds of endometriosis, how do those affect diagnosis and treatment? Or are you not at that stage yet? Are you still developing that?
So we are still in development, and we've decided to stay in this stage for longer because of all the diversity that we're seeing. I think the biggest advances for the field lies in if you don't cut corners and start looking at these different subtypes, try to choose one, and then work with pharma to develop drugs for these specific subtypes. But how it affects diagnosis and treatment is very direct. Is if it's not one condition, then you won't have a one-size-fits-all, both in the diagnostic space and in the treatment. And that's important because, especially for the funding and the development, VCs and sometimes pharma, they tend to think, I'm gonna put all my eggs in one company. But what I think is going to happen is that there will be some tests that would be most suited for one subtype, and then other tests that would be better suited for another. And the same with drugs, because in the drug development space, endometriosis has a very, very high failure rate. We've calculated as 3 times more than the average industry standards. And it's because when you include your patients, they are actually included without any molecular stratification. Is every endometriosis patient without the heterogeneity captured. And then your endpoint is a visual pain score. So imagine how many confounding factors you have in that. And that means that of all the drugs that have been tried in the last few years, to my knowledge, everyone but one has failed before reaching phase 3, which is, I think, also a very important number, because it means that your development is very expensive. And, you have your high hopes, you take it until phase 2, and then your phase 2 data doesn't map anything that you've been, seeing before.
How do you think that we get away from that one-size-fits-all approach?
I think it's stopping this conception, as I said, that you need to try to capture the entire market. I think this came from pharma thinking that unless you capture the whole thing, it wasn't a very good business case. And I think that's being debated more and more because you get also more attractive pricings if you profile your population better. And what happened is that these pharmas forecasted these large populations with a specific pricing, and then they don't get 10% of what they forecasted. So then it's a failure, no? But how we move away from that is, as I said, start profiling and start doing more targeted therapies. What might end up happening is when you understand the biology, is that the target you identify might work for endometriosis and maybe another condition that, as I said, is affecting how these endometrial cells, for example, specialize. It's more driven by biology than just by sort of external observational symptoms, no?
It seems like it's an area that's kind of ripe for not just research, but for companies to come in. It seems like it's at a very early stage, I guess.
For me, it's the new GLP-1 area, and we've had discussions with Eli Lilly on this, that it's a beautiful area, for example, and they are not afraid, for example, of low pricing drugs. They understand the value of volume, and they also have seen how you can persuade regulators, right? And so it's the same with endometriosis. Just because historically it's been difficult, it doesn't mean that we can't continue to try and succeed, especially because science has advanced a lot in the last 15 years in uterine health. So totally agree. I think it's a fascinating area to be in and one that is going to become very exciting.
Other than endometriosis, are there other conditions that you're working on?
I mean, as a startup, we need to focus. So our biggest developments are in endometriosis, but we've already seen applications in fertility. And then there is, all of this application to more gynecological oncology, because naturally, for example, endometrial cancer, ovarian cancer, things like this, you expect to find biomarkers in this type of sample. And one interesting thing, especially because our CSO, she comes from looking at endometriosis, but also looking at aging, is also uterine aging and also performance. When you look at, for example, sport athletes, etc., the uterus can tell you a lot of information about inflammatory signals and recovery. So really, it's a very exciting sample, but we are focused on endometriosis mostly for now.
What are the challenges associated with developing diagnostic tests and new treatments in women's health?
It's an area that is not for the faint of heart because there are a few, and you need to like tough projects. We like them at Endogene. I like to think if it were easy, it would be solved. No? So you need to get creative. And I'm a physicist, so I love complicated things and trying to isolate and put things together. I think the biggest one is funding. Like with little funding, there's little you can do, especially if you have to profile patients prospectively. Because as I said, access to deeply characterized in terms of multiple omics and phenotype patients, it's hard. So most companies have to run this prospectively. In oncology, you have so many biobanks, so many data repositories that you can advance very quickly in this first part. But this is something in women's health you don't have the luxury of. So you have to build from zero. That has also an upside because you build suddenly a proprietary data sets and infrastructure. But then the other issue, as I said, is that when you move into development and you have to compare with gold standards, the gold standards are, as I said, either very invasive like a laparoscopy. So in the current practice, they don't tend to use it that much. So when you're trying to find patients, it's difficult. And the other issue is, as I said, the endpoints, which is looking at a subjective pain score. So this makes extracting insights and data very difficult. But I think if you start adding molecular relevant markers, things will become a lot clearer because everyone's treating this disease like it's a big mystery and it's so complicated. But, having seen the progress that we've had in oncology, we've sent men to the moon and we've done quantum physics. Honestly, this problem is just a matter of segmenting it. How you tackle every complex problem, you segment. And here what I'm finding is that there's a bit of resistance to this approach.
So what are you doing and where are you at in the pathway of creating products?
So we've done now 3 clinical studies to collect different types of data that we can use to analyze. We've demonstrated that the technology is useful for diagnosis. And we've recently published a preprint on drug repositioning because we wanted to show the capabilities of the platform to identify sort of novel targets or novel ways to treat the condition. And basically our next steps is we're starting to pursue data generation partnerships, both with academic and clinical centers and with pharmaceutical companies, which for us is very important.
Yeah, how important are those partnerships and collaborations, and what are you doing in that respect?
For us, crucial, because there's this notion that big pharma is not doing women's health. So, for VCs, when they evaluate your case, they tend to think, but who's your acquirer? There are not that many. And so we want to demonstrate that that is not the case. It's been like this because there wasn't something exciting. If you come with all drugs, of course, no pharma will be interested. But I'm trying to think about it more how we do in oncology, right? Per modalities rather than a specific indication. And I would like to think that some pharmas that aren't traditionally doing female health would be interested in the space if we showed that there's an overlap with some of the exciting drugs that they're discussing. Like there's a lot of room in immunology to do this. There's a lot of room in oncology. We had some interesting drugs that have been successfully repurposed for benign tumors. So I'm not saying we use strong treatments, but I think some of the things that we develop for some of these conditions can be rethought for endometriosis and conditions like this in uterine health. And so for us, early partnerships where we do data generation and we sort of do co-discovery are crucial for us to also demonstrate that this is feasible business.
And how is what you're doing going to help with down the road with clinical trials?
I think the main output that we want to see is less failures in these trials, because the less failures we see, the more pharmas will want to jump into this as well. And so the more treatments will be available for women. So down the line, how I see us contributing to the space is helping drugs reaching patients faster, and those drugs being more disease modifying than they are today.
I guess it's a bit like a circle from what you were describing. The venture capital is a piece of the puzzle, and so are the big pharma companies and what you're doing, and academia with it seems like everything needs to kind of fall into place in order for all of this to happen.
Yes and no, because I think there's always in this sort of conundrums, there's always someone that steps up first and makes a few sacrifices, and then it kicks things forward. And I like to think that that's how us and some of these companies are doing. We are deciding to go and not having to wait until things are perfect. If you look at oncology, how the more precision approaches started, it was kind of in parallel. There was drug development and then there was biomarker development. And at some point they realized, actually, I need this because it helps my trials. It's not a burden. It's actually helping trials. And I think there's still some way to go in oncology, but I think it does it better than other therapeutic areas. I think ultimately it's like we've been treating endometriosis and uterine conditions like a black box, right? And we're trying to open the box with data and insights. And so it will make the rest of the circle think about it in an easier way.
How close do you think you are to a lot of these things becoming more, when you were saying about how the goal is to help more people, how close do you think that all of this is?
I'm hoping this is in the course of our company life cycle. So I think in the next 5 years, things are going to change dramatically, just like they changed 5 years ago. Our company, it's going to be 5 years old this year. And the difference I've seen from when I started to now is gigantic. A lot of companies popping up in the space. And before that, I used to work at Merck and I did fertility for a while in portfolio expansion. So looking at what was coming, and the growth is exponential. So I think we will see big changes in the next 5 years. I'm not sure if we will have the first precision drug in the market, but certainly we will see companies rethinking how they do the trial. We're already seeing it. Some companies are asking, how can we actually integrate what you do into our preclinical, our clinical studies? So I'm confident, and I'm a positive person. If I thought everything was lost, I wouldn't be here. So I think it's possible.
How important has AI been in the data analysis and getting you to where you are?
The key question. So we use it because when you analyze methylation and single cell RNA, you need these pipelines, especially when your patient data set is not like hundreds of thousands of patients. No, I think it's a tool, and it will allow us to unlock a lot. For example, another way where we use it is we have these foundational models that have been trained on super large data sets, and then you can actually take those and fine tune them with your cell annotation, with your smaller patient data set, because they have learned a lot of the kind of biology mechanics, when you apply it to your data set, they're much better at predicting than if you develop the model from zero. But I think we still need to generate a lot more data to see the big breakthroughs that we've seen in other areas. It's interesting because we went to JP Morgan and there are all these Amazon Web Service and NVIDIA sponsored panels where they show these amazing tools that they've put out for everybody. And when we go and speak with them, they always say the same thing, but with so little data, actually it's hard to implement. So it can change the field of women's health and uterine health in our case, but we need the data to be there. Without data, fields like ours that don't have a lot of data will have an even bigger gap, I think, in the future, because things are advancing so fast with AI that if you leave the data creation behind for these therapeutic areas, nobody will want to work on them because you cannot use so much AI on them.
Is there a way to get around that so that the data is more available?
We need to invest in data creation like we did with oncology, like we've done with some rare diseases, where investing in creating the infrastructure means that then you can apply a lot of things. I like the example of the UK Cancer Centre, right, where you have a GSK and AstraZeneca that they've poured resources into this, and then when the data comes out, they have an exclusivity period, but then it's open to everybody, and so it allows for a lot of analysis to be done. We need the same in women's health. So VCs need to get comfortable and pharmas need to get comfortable funding the data infrastructure part, the same as the beginnings of AI. How well you generate the data, how well you tag it, will define how good your models will be at extracting insights.
Women's health in general has been an underserved area, so it's great that Endogene.bio is making waves and making progress in endometriosis, and hopefully other areas too as we move forward. So that's it for this week's podcast. If you do want to get in touch with guest opportunities, or if you want to advertise, please feel free to contact us at jim@deeptechdigest.com. Interviews are back to normal now, I think. Lots to do over the next couple of weeks, by which time it may have stopped raining. If there are any companies out there doing phase 3 trials on getting people away from rain to sunshine, I volunteer to participate. So, until next time, wherever in the world you are, I hope you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Base to Base Biotech podcast.
The Base to Base Biotech podcast is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.